Hi, Mage fans. This is your host, Terry Robinson with Mage the Podcast. And joining me today is friend of the show and frequent contributor and outright canon of material on the Storyteller Vault and noted storyteller, Charles Siegel. And we are doing a first installment of what may be a series called Answering Ascension. We at Mage the Podcast get a couple of questions that tend to pop up a lot, as well as kind of recurring arguments that occur in the Discord. And I, as someone who both was raised in the Church of Catholicism and Star Wars, am familiar with the phenomenon of apologetics, where someone says, "This doesn't make sense." How do? And my favorite version of Star Wars apologetics are the TIE fighters screaming through space, where someone says, oh no, that scream effect is actually an internal targeting system to the ship, which makes it easier to maintain spatial awareness of other vessels. So it is actually a piece of military kit that most ships have, and they're not actually producing a sound. And when that happened, I'm like, oh man, that's utter bullshit. And hey, then there's Mage, and Charles is also quite skilled in that. Before we get in, Charles, how you doing?
I'm doing well, keeping busy.
Certainly. Are there any general principles you try and keep in mind when trying to iron out setting difficulties or oddities in Mage?
I guess the biggest one is if something doesn't seem to make sense, I try to think, is there a historical explanation for it? Because when in doubt, people believe weird things, and the consensus is a kind of get out of jail free card for certain types of contradictions.
I think one of the big ones for me is that reality is kind of made up of layers, and a lot of people seemingly presume that everything figurative is literal, that when a mage is talking about interacting with the spirit of a place or something like that, that it is necessarily a literal spirit, where to me, I am perfectly fine saying that is a figure of speech for the embodiment of that idea that the mage is interfacing with. In the same way that philosophically, there are people who do not believe in a unitary notion of self, that it makes sense to talk to about a person as a being. We as humans tend to go the other way. We tend to be default essentialists in that we view a certain set of properties as composing an entity, and that entity is a discrete thing, when a lot of times in reality, it's kind of hard to tell where the sidewalk ends and the driveway begins if they're made out of the same material, or figuring out where one biome bleeds into another one, or even where one organ starts and another one ends.
I will admit, my notions of identity, discreteness of objects, and frankly, the existence of objects were completely overturned when I learned particle physics. When you start really drilling down into how the universe seems to actually work, more and more you realize that our intuition is really useful for surviving, but really bad for correctness in circumstances that aren't directly applicable to surviving, I should say. We're very good at saying, that's a tiger, run. We're very bad at saying, so the wavicle does this?
Yeah, and there's a certain tendency we have towards verbal neatness that sweeps a lot of things under the rug, where you use the term wavicle, where a lot of people are like, sometimes they're particles, sometimes they're waves. Maybe it's better to just have this other model of describing how matter works.
That's one of the things that I bring to Mage, when I run things, that I picked up from my math and physics background, which is when you have to say, well, it's sometimes this and sometimes that, maybe you need a different word to describe what it actually is to break yourself from assuming it will behave like your preconceived notions.
And another one that pops up a lot for me is kind of, I don't want to quite say infinite regress, but we have a lot of questions of why. Our reality does not bear that level of scrutiny. Well, why are you demanding the game? Like, why are you demanding more of the philosophical consistency of a game than you would for our actual reality?
I have a bit more sympathy to that. Though, again, this is partly based on my view of the world, which other people would disagree with, which is simply that no one designed the world we live in. It just kind of happened and is. We can point to the people who wrote Mage. They have Facebook profiles.
So, Charles, why do mages pursue Ascension if it is tantamount seemingly to death?
So, I'm one of the people who often brings up that Ascension seems a lot like death. Maybe we shouldn't be focusing on it so hard. It changes the tone of the game if you reinterpret everything that way and say, so the goal of the traditions is suicide. I tend to take it that Ascension is essentially mythological. that it may or may not make any sense as a concept. Like in a personal, you poof out of existence into some higher plane. I also take the view on Ascension to be the fundamental distinction between the three intended as PC groups in Mage. We'll call it Mage 20 for definiteness. That the traditions believe in individual ascension and individual enlightenment. The goal is to understand everything yourself in some personalized way, which leads them to believe that there is some higher existence that you can achieve. The technocracy looks at collective enlightenment and collective ascension, so they have a utopian view of the world that they want to achieve. And maybe you see that as dystopian, but their view is that it's a utopian world. And then the crafts say, we've got stuff to do. Why are you wasting time on this? In this and in very few other places, my true sympathy lies with the crafts.
I think there's also space to say Ascension is a direction, and it may not be achievable, but the process of pursuing that is valuable unto itself, in the same way that I would consider myself to be a Albert Camus-style absurdist. I do not think that existence has meaning, but I think the search for meaning gives us something that really looks like meaning, and that makes life worth it.
Yeah, I definitely can take aspects of that. Like, my view is that these three groups have their beliefs about Ascension, and those beliefs are what matters, but that Ascension itself may or may not be real. Clearly, the pursuit of Ascension has driven some very significant things in the Mage setting.
And my take on it is we don't really get much information about Ascension as a process. We get one rando character in 2E that ascends, and we get the indication in M20 that when you hit Arite 10 as a technomancer, you merge with the technocracy. Cool, but I would like literally anything more on that. Book of the Fallen gives us a bunch of information.
Yeah, we got a lot of information about descent and what happens when Nephandi ascend, to the point where it was a little off-putting to me that we haven't gotten that about anything else in the entire game.
To me, the fundamental question is Ascension is, to me, what is known in philosophy as a transformational change. This is that the person who makes the change and the person who lives with the results of that change are not the same. A simple example of this would be the embrace. You are so fundamentally different once you are a vampire that the person appraising the vampireness of their being is not the same in, I think, a very basic way as the person who maybe was embraced. A more close to home version to that is parenthood. Babies change your brain. Yeah. The person who decided
as someone with a 17-month-old, the person you are before and the person you are after, there is continuity. You can look back, you can see how you got there, you can recognize yourself, but you're different.
Yeah, I personally had a medical issue about a decade ago that very much affected me in certain ways, and I feel comfortable saying that Terry who got ill and that Terry who finished the recovery and treatment were not the same. I generally don't believe in a unitary notion of self. I think it is a set of baton passings at best of people who look somewhat similar. So if we view it through that lens, that it is transformational, it kind of disconnects the why. But it could be one of those things where you want to merge with the pattern of the cosmos. Your notion of consciousness and separateness is no longer the same.
Yeah, if you'll pardon me bringing Blue Mage into things for a minute, Blue Mage being Mage the Awakening. Mage the Awakening actually does talk about Ascension in a decent amount of detail in actually useful ways. And it really plays into this who you are before and after are different in the same way that Awakening changes who you are fundamentally. The beginning of the road to Ascension as an active thing rather than just an idealized thing is even referred to as a second awakening in the Imperial Mysteries book.
And we get the idea in Purple Mage that there is a similar thing, that the 6th dot is as far above the 5th dot as the first dot is above the 0th, seemingly in terms of understanding.
Yeah, the mechanics are you get an extra dot. Thematically, supposedly, Arite 6 is a fundamental break, whereas Arite 5 is, more of the same in some sense.
So your consciousness may merge with the cosmos. You are no longer the same type of being. So to us, you are dead, but to the cosmos itself, you are some other type of being. You could simply drop out of mage affairs and no longer care about interacting with it. You could have this state of Buddha-like serenity. You could be this bodhisattva-like entity that is so attuned to the universe that they simply drop out of perception. I kind of like this because it makes the path of occultation and ascension very similar in that regard. The path of occultation was this idea that was introduced in Lost Paths that Ali Bettini sometimes pursue going to 10 dots of arcane and erasing themselves from existence. That to me is the more deathier version of ascension. And I also think it raises interesting questions. What are other similar paths that could have some weird apex to them?
Everything, of course, is depending on interpretation of various traditions or whatnot. And you could take the Akashic, who, say, truly achieves personal, physical and mental harmony and perfection, and no longer has that need to struggle and conflict in the way that Akashics generally push themselves because they've achieved that. So this ascension could still leave you as just a person who's around, just uninterested in the day-to-day politics of the Ascension War, and this gets you your master sitting on a mountaintop that you can go and quest to go have a chat with and ask for their insights. And then their insights are cryptic and baffling because you are not enlightened enough to understand them.
Mm-hmm. So one of the questions is, so why do they pursue it? This could just be a question of drive. I need to know more. And it just so happens that at some point there is a critical sea change at which you are no longer the type of entity that most of us would notice, that you pass some sort of Rubicon, even though it seems like a set of gradual transformations. You could be pushed by the avatar saying, hey, figure this out. It could be the case that pursuing enlightenment or pursuing Arite is some sort of incredibly difficult to scratch itch. And that when you do have that seeking and get that moment of clarity, it is almost literally addictive. So I think it's easy to come up with directions towards it that people pursue, even if necessarily it is not spoken of widely as a thing that mages necessarily pursue as a culture.
So one thing that I have used, though it didn't really matter much in the game where I had this in my head as what Ascension was for that game, is that Ascension is actually very bad for the mage. They die, but their avatar no longer is part of the cycle of rebirth. It's the avatar that wants to ascend, and the mage is the vehicle it is using to do so. This actually was my answer to a different setting question, which was, the setting seems to indicate that questing avatars are rarer, but that questing avatars are more likely to go Archmage or Ascend or whatnot. Maybe they're just doing that, and there's fewer of them around now.
Yeah, that they have cycled out, as it were, that even if there were some equal pool of them, they are disproportionately likely to kind of make their way out. We make a lot of mistakes thinking that biology is centered around the entity, when in fact it is centered around the gene. We have the notion of the selfish gene, and that explains a lot of weird things. I think we could bring up a selfish avatar view of Mage. So the selfish gene is the idea that preservation of the individual is not the most important thing in biology, it is the preservation of the gene. And that when you look at it from this perspective, we get certain paradoxical biological behaviors suddenly make sense. Like, for instance, having large portions of your species not actively participating in reproduction, like bees. When a hive is sufficiently close in genetic makeup, it makes sense for some people to forego reproduction to make sure that the hive as a whole is fine, because that will ensure continued passing on of their genes, which leads to one of my favorite quotes from JBS Haldane of, would you give your life for that of your brother? And he said, no, but I would do it for 2 or 8 cousins. The idea being that would be the equivalent amount of genetic material.
It is one of those things that Mage leaves very, very undefined, and that in most games doesn't actually matter. So you can get away with not answering it most of the time.
Next question. Do sleeper spacecraft like New Horizons enter the Umbra? So one of my central conceits is that Mage kind of breaks down in space. We have the idea that in the Deep Umbra, the barrier between Deep Umbra and the mundane side of reality is quite thin. But then at the exact same time, Mage says crossing into the Deep Umbra from the Near Umbra requires passing at an anchorhead where you're asked cryptic questions, or you have to use like Spirit 17 to make your own. And to me, these two setting things don't really get along. Well, the Umbra out there is kind of poorly defined and space is big. In Revised, we get the idea of Tegmark lensing, which is that there is some way that sleepers do not know how to see all the kooky stuff that is theoretically out there in space. In the Book of Madness, for instance, we get literally some sort of great entity that is moving across the surface of a star. So my answers to this are, so if the gauntlet is very thin, then there's giant space horrors that could destroy us that could simply cross over and then travel in. To me, there are two ways of dealing with this. The gauntlet out there is very thin, but very few of those monsters are immune to the vacuum of space. Cthulhu is fine in the Umbra, but the moment they cross into the vacuum of space, you get like a frozen Cthulhu lump. And maybe they cross the tentacle over and they go, oh, my bad. Another option is sleepers take a kind of gauntlet with them that mages and hyperscience in some way cancel out. A mundane ship that went into space isn't going to see anything weird, but with a whiff of magic present, that can change it and be affected by it. So it's not like you can bring a sleeper along with you as like a portable shield generator, as much as I kind of like that idea. We can also talk about space monsters as just kind of being a way of seeing. For instance, we represent a rainstorm on a map with a little cloud and a thunderbolt symbol. That's not actually what a thunderstorm looks like. So when a mage sees some terrible outer umbral entity, it's just a way of seeing what is this swirling mass of energy and potence, and that may be closer to what a sleeper sees, that they see anomalous particle effects or an area where there's unusual ionic activity which changes their mood and causes their ship to break down, which we would recognize as charms being used by the Umbrood. A sleeper going through the shanty of entropy in space may simply notice that everything requires more maintenance. They reconsider the choices they made and other such things tied to the breakdown of all things, where a mage may see a writhing worm mass. You kind of get to the same place with both.
Vanilla and radiation belts.
I'm not sure where that notion comes from originally, but to me it directly conflicts with what we know about the anchorheads. What are your thoughts, Charles?
Would Voyager cross into the Umbra? My answer is just a firm flat no, though I think my arguments are different from yours. And I agree that the Umbra, the deep Umbra and deep space becoming one thing doesn't make sense. It breaks in too many ways. I have thought a lot about Mage in Space. I run Mage in Space not regularly, but not rarely either.
This isn't your first Space Mage rodeo.
Not too long ago, ran a Dream Speaker and a Virtual Adept in an Oldsmobile driving to the Copernicus Research Station. So, that's the kind of thing that happens sometimes. Dream Speaker was a master, so Spirit 5 was used quite a lot. Where they were going, there were no roads. My view is that the gauntlet in space is very, very thin. It is a low difficulty to cross over. This is balanced by the fact that it is quite high difficulty for a random mage to get to Mars on this side of the gauntlet. If you build a ship and fly to Jupiter with forces and correspondence and whatever else you need to hold the matter, presumably, and all sorts of stuff, then yeah, you have like a gauntlet rating of 2. Go for it. Get into the Deep Umbra, have some fun. You just built the spaceship that got you to Jupiter. You deserve it. Alternately, you can go through the Deep Umbra, go through all the anchorheads, have your Master Spirit help out, and then you can pop out on Jupiter if you so please. And again, you did something very hard. I don't think one side is actually harder or easier than the other. Though probably getting there in the mundane world is going to take longer and be more expensive. But sphere-wise, it's probably you probably need 4 or 5 dots of correspondence to handle those distances, forces to get up to speed, things like... It's probably harder to get there in space than it is in the Umbra. I have no problem with, say, the various factions getting to the Shade Realms and Shard Realms centuries ago. But then there's the 1870s when they were magically potent enough to finally actually get to the moon on this side of the gauntlet. Meanwhile, Doisitep's been in the Shard Realm of Forces for centuries. So I'm sure mages have been on Mars and Venus and Mercury and so on. But again, getting there in the physical world is still new-ish. There's still 3 mages around who just remember when they couldn't do it.
So to you, the gauntlet is never so thin that a mundane object could stumble across it.
In spots, sure, but there's spots like that on Earth.
Got it.
I have no problem with shallowings in random spots in space. But space is big. If you're not aiming for it, you're not getting to one.
And do you think unbelief affects that? Do you think, for instance, it is possible for a canal on Mars that exists in the Shard realm to fall through one of those intermittent shallowings, but then be quickly removed by unbelief?
Yeah, I have no problem with that. I'd go farther and say that until we were better at looking at Mars, those canals were just perfectly real, just fine right there. But now we're looking and we have expectations and the consensus is pushing stuff out. And what's unbelief except for the consensus?
And then to some extent you have the fight between what we thought we would see there and what our knowledge of physics suggests should be there. So it's not like the consensus could necessarily cause those canals to reflow possibly, but there's kind of this internal fight.
I definitely think the consensus could cause them to reflow if physics were rejected as part of the consensus. Like, if the consensus went full aetherite, there's canals on Mars now.
Sorcerers are known to be made up of a fairly sizable portion of standard tradition groups. The Hermetics in particular in the revised books are actually teach Sorcerer's Paths with their standard education. Do Sorcerer's Paths start out as mage rotes, or are rotes just for mages, and are they their own thing?
In Paths of Power, I made my thoughts about this pretty clear, which was that there is a process by which, awakened magic becomes rotes, and then rotes become paths and rituals. And I based that process on the creation of wonders, essentially. Like mages start by just doing a thing. Then they do it 10 times and they figure out how to do it well and right. And then it spreads, and they, as a collective group, do it so much that they've kind of worn a groove in reality that lets that thing happen. And then you have sorcerers who start figuring out how to use usually some somewhat weaker and slower version of that as a path or a ritual, but only once it's been sufficiently ingrained in the world. Something like this kind of, to me, has to be the case for the technocracy to work.
Why is that?
The whole premise of the technocracy is arguably that they turn magic into the mundane and put it in the hands of the sleepers, which means they have to have some process by which their adjustments and procedures become just completely mundane things that random sleepers can do. And my view is it goes off the cuff effect to rote to maybe a ritual to a full ritual or path, and then eventually that just becomes a thing that you can do. You could do this with very difficult and highly specialized training. A random person couldn't really be an effective arquebusier, 500 years ago. First guns were hard, very difficult magic. Then they were a procedure that had been tried and true. And then an implementation of a path probably very similar to the Path of Hellfire. And then eventually they just became a thing that people could do. And now they've gone full circle and we have 10 spheres.
So one of the things brought up by the basic question is that a sizable portion of standard tradition groups are sorcerers. This is something that is kind of brought up in revised. In the individual implementation, it's not really there outside of the Hermetics and the technocracy. In the technocracy, we get regular information that you've got 5-1, 10-1, 15-1, extraordinary citizen to enlightened technocrat. A few of the groups, like the Society of Ether, are like, yeah, some people will never be geniuses, but they can help us. And the Hermetics are still like, well, a lot of these people are failures, and we kind of shuffle them away. And a few of the other groups are like, we can't tell the difference. So there's a pretty broad spectrum. That idea that most of the magic users in the groups are sorcerers is kind of preserved for the technocracy, just kind of as a note. My interpretation of sorcery is that it is the apex of the power of a mythic thread to affect reality in kind of a codified way. It follows what mortals think it is. So the process of going from theoretically rote to path is slightly discontinuous. So someone sees a wizard use the spheres to control weather and gets that established as an idea that weather can be controlled. And then there is this idea that there are a bunch of ways that you need to go about doing it. And that is kind of where those things come up from. I would be curious to see sorcerers' paths that are tied to traditions. Like, if they are based on rote, I would expect more sorceress paths that follow rotes, and vice versa. For instance, the path of enchantment and the path of alchemy kind of seemingly in a bunch of ways outstrips what mages can do easily in some cases.
They are better wonder-making systems than Prime.
Yeah. So I am inclined to think that they are separate. And the fact that, for instance, weather control, at least in M20, now requires theoretically a bucket of spheres, whereas we just have weather control as kind of a separate thing. A bunch of the paths kind of blend spheres together in an interesting way, not to mention psychic powers as a phenomenon, but that's kind of beyond the scope of it. So for me, I err towards treating them as separate things. The necessity of exactitude and the inability to improvise does kind of make them a seemingly on a spectrum, but to me, they are tapping into things in reality less so than things in the person doing them, which is just kind of an arbitrary thing. I get that. I tend to treat them as separate things.
I definitely agree there. I tend to treat whatever the paradigm of the mage is doing a thing when they do magic. Whatever the paradigm of the sorcerer is just relying on something that anyone could do in theory if they had sufficient training and dedication to it. Like, I very much believe that you could take anyone off the street if you could get them to put in the effort. They could make, a path and its rituals work for them.
Mm-hmm.
But if you take a random person off the street, they're not going to be able to do spheres. I have some disagreements with you about demographics of mages and sorcerers, but we've hashed that out enough times that we can pass on that right now.
Yeah, it's part of it to me is the fact that the individual group books in Revised aren't necessarily consistent, where they're like, yeah, I guess we have them. Where in the Sorcerer book, we get a bunch more information. And so the only splat books that reiterate it seemingly are the Hermetic ones and the Technocracy ones.
I kind of always interpret that as they reiterate it and they talk about the way that sorcerers outnumber mages simply because those are the most structured groups. They're the ones that keep track of their members the best.
It also kind of goes to the Revised idea that a tradition can be an adjective, where a tradition just kind of describes what you do, or it can be a political thing. So if you just refer to all people who do the necessary but unwanted jobs in a society and generally tend towards the dead, yes, they're all euthanatoi, whether they know it or not. Or you could have the structured definition that says, no, they're part of this political bloc. And I'm really kind of fine with either of those, or a blend of the two. But for me, there is a definition where, yes, all of those sorcerers who tend for the dead and act as psychopomps and clean up various versions of the wheel are euthanatoi in some way, or overseen by euthanatoi, in the same way that we get the idea that the Disparate Alliance has like a remit, that each of the Alliance members has a group of mortals they look over that are in some way theirs. Short one. What happens when unawakened folks can do things only mages could do before?
That is now a thing that's part of the consensus
Yep.
that they can do it. Like, that's it. I literally used the example of guns earlier. Being able to just point something at someone and have them die was super high level magic for a long time. And in many modern popular fantasy franchises, pointing a thing at someone and making them die is very powerful dark magic, and you can get an object that does that at Walmart.
For me, it just a sign reality has changed. I think it would be interesting if there were maybe a few more gradations where it went from coincidental to skilled mortal can use it. So it would kind of go down to you need 4 dots and point to make someone die, and then eventually over time it goes down lower and lower through a combination of that belief permeating through society and personal knowledge and the devices themselves changing. I think it's more interesting to ask the reverse question. What are things humans could previously do that they can't now? Like, was low-level sorcery formerly much more common? Was the ability to talk to spirits something that humans could always do? Is there anything that we've lost?
That though conceptually it's just a very simple, yeah, people can do this now. Mechanically, there's especially if you're going to run a game that covers centuries, you need to have answers to questions like, how does a piece of magic become an ability? Firearms. It was not an ability 1,000 years ago, but we definitely could. Early predecessors of the Order of Reason using things that you could classify as firearms. Mm-hmm. Certainly, things that you would classify as artillery were showing up in the Seeds of Mistridge. And if you look at the secondary abilities in M20, you've got energy weapons. How is that an ability? How is Doe an ability?
Yeah, Doe's kind of an interesting one there, especially some of the secondary ones that have their own little subsystems tied to it.
I will say that I'll admit that my view is that energy weapons and Doe should not be abilities. They are not things. I interpret them as not things that just random sleepers could just do. I treat Do kind of as the martial arts practice, but specialized to Akashics. And I treat energy weapons as being an instrument for hypertech.
I could see them being essentially saying esoterica energy weapons.
I would absolutely allow that. I would also take a similar approach with technology. I would actually take that approach with technology and well-skilled craftsmen. There is that big question of what could people do once upon a time that they can't just do now? Mm-hmm. One of the best places to get ideas for that might be fun to include in your game is mythology. Like, there's plenty of stories of just like random people talking to the dead. Like, I've never spoken to a dead person. Very few people I know claim to have done so. At the very least, it's a skill that is much rarer now, if you believe that it's a skill that exists at all. That's why there's a merit medium.
Yeah, one of the things we do in Mage is we frequently say that the things the supernatural could do has changed, or we call it a higher gauntlet. So it could be the case that mortals, the gauntlet has always been roughly as thick, or something like that, or the ability of entities has always been roughly the same. It's just that humans have kind of forgotten how to talk in that way that ghosts can hear, or to walk in that way that allows them to stumble into the enchanted wood, or to arrange their house in such a way that house spirits can manifest. I kind of like the idea of flipping that. Next question. How real are the 9 spheres? Are they cosmological constants? If not, what are the Shade Realms? The spheres are contrived. They are useful. The tie to the Shade Realms is entirely a coincidence. There is an arbitrary number of realms that represent an idea. It just so happens that the spheres are sufficiently taken up with in Mage that there are portals that tied to the planets that go to that place. If we had different spheres, we would have different portals that go to different places. The tricky part more to me is the fact that we tie them to planets. So how has that gone over time? And to me, if there is a location that enough mages think is tied to a concept idea, a portal becomes a thing that is there. That to me is not too different. In Mage, we frequently talk about things being in the same place, where I prefer to think in a lot of cases there is just kind of a network of portals that lets you easily get back and forth between the two. Who cares where they actually are? There is a transit relationship between the two, even if they are not geographically close to each other. For instance, in the Dark Ages, there was probably a realm tied to each pillar that each culture had located to a place, and that would be perfectly fine. They didn't have associations necessarily with the planets, so the Shade Realms did not tie in the same way. All of the realms are fundamentally free-floating in some way out in the material of the cosmos, and they just happen to be connected. If we had different spheres, there would be different portals. So to me, they are not cosmologically constant. They are useful. The spheres maybe change over time. The interpretation of them has changed over time. And if we look at the information we get about the Shade Realms, especially for minds and spirit and time, it kind of gets weird. Like, the way the realms are described is vague enough that they do seem to have a theme to it, but I think there are other lenses we could look through that describe what they actually are.
So I'm going to bite my tongue on the issues that pillars cause, because it doesn't help that Mage canonically says that the spheres were defined first 1500 BC-ish with the Reed and the Cup. So that means that the pillars represent loss of knowledge, which I guess is fitting thematically for Dark Ages, but also then you have the question of why are the Bettini using them? I'm going to just put the question of the pillars aside. I'm going to take 1 second to complain that Sorcerer's Crusade used the word entropy, which didn't exist in that era. To me, the spheres are a battleground of Ascension. Like, just defining how magic works is a fundamental aspect of the Ascension War. One of the reasons I don't like that they use the word that of all things, they changed correspondence, which is an ancient word, to connection, but they didn't change entropy to fate for Sorcerer's Crusade, is that, to me, the transition from the sphere of fate to the sphere of entropy was a technocratic victory. And right now, we are watching in real time the change from correspondence to data. So to me, that's the usefulness of the technocratic alternate spheres. They are attempting to supplant the mystic versions and put a more scientific notion of what it is at the heart of the magic the traditions use. The fact that they accept the sphere of entropy is a huge defeat they took in the Ascension War. That said, how do these changes happen? I agree with you that the spheres are not fundamental constants of the universe. I do, however, believe that the spheres are real, but they are a social construct. And dollars are real, but they have meaning because we all agree they have meaning.
Got it. Real in the same way that the family is real.
Exactly. To me, what is actually fundamental and that mages could uncover if they investigated hard enough, but it's very difficult to get at this, is there's infinitely many tiny realms, one for each kind of type of magical effect. For lack of being creative enough to drive down to whatever the minimal magical effect is, I group them into I basically have the specialties for spheres. There's a transformation realm that is kind of glommed onto like the healing realm and cloning realm and all these other realms, and they make up the realm of life that isn't really a thing, but it's what we call this collection of realms that kind of bleed into each other. One side effect of this is that, especially if you like linguistic games, you've got a transformation specialty in life, you've got a transformation specialty in matter. That means that there is a realm that is a tiny realm that is part of both the sphere of life, the shade realm of life, and the shade realm of matter. And if you want to go from Venus to Jupiter in a hurry, go through it. So sleepers don't have any input on on these realms. They don't understand that the spheres exist, and they don't understand that the Umbra exists. So the consensus on these is entirely driven by mages. This brings up the question of, well, why does the technocracy use them? Reed in the Cup. The Reed in the Cup. They appear in like 3 books. They're canon. So in Egypt, about 2,500 years ago or so, everyone agreed on 9 cornerstones of creation, and everything else is descended from that. And because people are in contact, the drift hasn't gotten too far, just like we can communicate. If you want to change a sphere, what you're doing is changing which subrealms connect to it in what ways. So why would a Euthanatos or a Hermetic think that death and random chance should be connected to each other? Logically, they shouldn't. They shouldn't see the sphere of entropy. Death should be kind of this mysterious thing that has aspects of life and fate and time and so on. It's complicated. But the technocracy came up with the concept of entropy, which is a probabilistic notion that explains why things decay over time and what the end state of all things is, and pushed that notion into the consensus so hard in the 19th century that it won. And now mages who are mystics do it too, because they grow up in mundane society first, by and large. And so the sphere of fate becomes the sphere of entropy, and some of these little realms sort of shift where they are a little bit. The connection to the planets is kind of a coincidence. It's like the Order of Hermes said, hey, there's 9 planets, there's 9 realms, bet you they're the same. And everyone said, sure, why not? So now there aren't 9 planets, and we have a problem.
Yeah. And I would love to see someone talk about Maki Maki or Dysnomia or Eris or Ceres, and to find out.
Yeah, Ceres is the one that I usually go to. And then there's the much more complicated, and again, we're not going to go down the rabbit hole of space stuff today, I think. Exoplanets. Are those spheres for other systems of magic? Maybe.
Yeah.
Who knows?
The thing that I find interesting is I wouldn't be surprised, for instance, if there were a group of Nephondic mages that are trying to change the sphere of entropy further into the sphere of inevitability, or something like that, that we are waging these subtle wars. And if you do have a game where what each sphere does can differ a little bit by paradigm, I see those wars that every time you're able to add something to the remit of the sphere, you kind of shift the center of mass conceptually, and that's one way of doing it. I like that. You can also use, to answer Charles' questions about why do the technomancers use it, we do get other sphere names that just haven't caught on yet. For instance, we do get, what is it called in M20? A number of other spheres have technocratic titles. They don't have different sphere effects in the same way that we do for data.
But like, if you look back at some of the earlier technocracy books, like I'm rarely the person to praise something in first edition. I generally don't like first edition. And the Progenitors book for first edition was a very odd book, especially by modern mage standards, where you could wave a scalpel at someone and suddenly they're healed. But if you look at the effects lists, you can see them kind of struggling towards alternate spheres. There's a couple of sequences of the same sort of thing, 1 dot through 5 dot, that's almost like a minor sphere or something like that. That none of those concepts are quite fully realized at the time, because it was what, like the 3rd or 4th Mage book?
First Technomantic book, it was
yeah,
4.
it was super early.
Yeah, we got core, chantries, loom of fate, digital web, and then virtual adepts, and then I think progenitors or something like that.
Fifth supplement, fourth if you don't include Loom of Fate, which you shouldn't. This is a very fertile ground for the Ascension War, especially because it's that mages often think about what sleepers think, but sometimes they forget to worry about what other mages think. And I think that's also the big reason that the technocracy has been so successful, because they've engineered the consensus of mages by making mages believe the things that they want them to believe.
That feels particularly poignant with certain parallels with some people's ability to control political and national discourses on culture and so on, and being disproportionately effectiveness. Next question, has the number of awakened people gone up significantly over the years, or was the percentage of people who awakened way larger centuries ago? I would like to note that those are two different questions, the percentage and the number. Charles, what's your take on it?
There's a lot more awakened now, and I keep the percentage roughly constant. There's a smaller fraction of wizards than there were 1,000 years ago, but that's because there's more physicists who are awakened. The technocracy exists and is, depending on who you ask, maybe 45% of all mages. So if you take 45% of mages and don't think of them as people who are doing magic, then yeah, it's going to look like mages are about half as common. But I think a lot of it is the technocracy is where more awakened people are going than before, and it looks less like magic by and large. In many online discussions, pushed my mages are about 1 in 10,000 people number. And the reason I do that is because Ars Magica actually explicitly says how many hermetics there are in 1220. They tell you how many there are in each house. This is a bad idea for any game to do. I don't think any game should ever give exact numbers of PC-like characters.
5 Scourge Fellowship and Exalted. Anyway, that's my one exception.
Yeah, and there's 3 mages in your game, but
yes.
but that's also in your game, as opposed to in the game books. Mm-hmm. So the way I have handled Mage is the way I got to 10,000 is that if you add up those hermetics in the Middle Age in 1220 AD, you get something like 1 hermetic per 30 or 40,000 people. But there's also books that indicate that the Order of Hermes' monopoly on magic is far, far from absolute. For one thing, there's the Church, which would have the people who'd become the Celestial Chorus among them. You have various other groups. I rounded and got to say, if you call it 1 in 10,000 people is awake in the Middle Ages, that explains the numbers of hermetics pretty accurately, because they had much more of a monopoly than they do now, but they didn't really have a full monopoly at the time. And I carry that forward. I just say, well, we're still at 1 in 10,000 people are awakened. Lots of them are technocrats. Plenty of them are just boring people that have no interest in any of this nonsense. They just have, their small Arite 1 tricks, and that's it. So I keep the percentage constant, which means that the population explosion that has happened over the last 1,000 years means that there's a lot more mages than there used to be.
I come down in a slightly different case on this. And again, I believe that the percentage of people that awakened is dropping, but the number of mages is increasing. So our population is increasing faster than the rate of awakening is dropping. So way back, maybe you had 1 in 100 mages. Now, for me, I use 1 in 500,000. The way I square this is generally my games have a lot of tomes, grimoires, and primers running around because the chain of understanding is often not contiguous. I have a lot of mortal groups that kind of maintain the beliefs. I also, when a book says there's these mages over here doing something, I frequently treat that as a rumor, as opposed to it being a real thing necessarily. When they're like, there's a bunch of mages in Santa Clara that are doing this cool thing, I add the, I heard there were, which is just my way of taking it. I prefer a very intimate Ascension war. I very much like the idea that you know all your enemies. It is a world of nemesis. You respect them even if you want them dead. That's strictly personal choice.
I actually personally prefer a very political game where you need lots of people to maneuver against and groups to maneuver within, which means that my games are naturally going to gravitate towards more mages and often larger scale. That I tend to posit that level of intimacy starts showing up when you break the Arite 3 barrier. There are not so many adepts or so many masters that you don't know all of the adepts and masters in your local area, and you've heard of most of the ones in your tradition, period.
The flip side of that is the boom of awakenings. To me, to awaken, you need a couple things. You need a shock, you need to endure it, you need to have the will to internalize it. And as time goes on, as more of humanity is generally comfortable, but material adverse situations do. And to me, as generally more and more people have a comfortable lifestyle, they are much less likely to awaken in certain styles. This also allows me to do something where your disenfranchised groups do generate a disproportionate number of mages, and not because they're magical themselves. It lets me avoid some, those people are different and special. Like, no, they're under more pressure, and that creates the environment under which an avatar is more likely to establish itself. So that is generally how I deal with that, and that kind of solves two numbers questions, at least in my games. So is it possible for there to be a lot more awakenings? Yes. Does that also introduce the probability that there is a global catastrophe of some sort in my game, and suddenly there's an explosion of new mages? Yes. I kind of like that. So my answer to the question is the rate has dropped, the number has increased.
Related to that point, one thing that I have played with is a kind of social divide between mages who awaken through a shock. A car accident is the sort of shock that could awaken someone. Like I don't have a very high threshold for that necessarily. Like, you don't need to be a war orphan who an artillery shell just landed next to in order to awaken. Just a bad car accident that you awaken and teleport yourself out of is enough. Mm-hmm. But then I also have that class of mages who had quiet awakenings, often by spending some time as a sorcerer first. I have sometimes treated that as a class divide, that the ones who awakened because of their hard work. Actually, I've gone both ways. The ones who awaken by hard work are either the ones who earned their awakening, or the ones who just got there on hard work, whereas the ones who had trauma had some natural talent that pushed them to awaken. You can read it in either direction as being the way the sort of class structure would land. And I've done both. They're both interesting. And again, it's a consequence of that more politically driven game of networking and alliances and maneuvering that I tend to run.
How much do mages actually know about the nature of magic, paradigm, and consensus?
The technocracy studies it actively. That's been explicitly written in the books.
Yeah, we have the enlightened anthropic principle. It answers a lot of questions. Spontaneous theory and model generation explains a lot of the setting.
So to the extent that science as a thing makes sense in the Mage setting, it will drive you to the understanding that reality is malleable. And the technocracy books support that they've gotten there. And they are of the opinion that their remit is not just understand the world, but it's engineering reality. Like, reality engineer is a perfectly good job title if you're a technocrat.
And one of the things I think the books do that I find most interesting is when they double down on this and say there are certain people that have the ability to cause spontaneous instantiations, and those spontaneous instantiations, which is to say magical effects, are more potent the more you are able to thoroughly come up with an idea of how reality should work. When reality deviants do it, they do it in such a way that their models do not match with the model generated at base with humanity and kind of the smooth running of things. So yes, the technocracy fully recognizes that everyone else has a way of doing it, but they think that for any other group to get to a point where they had strong influence or control over the consensus would be so destructive that it should be pared away. And the technocracy is notionally the only group that is using rhetoric, planning, decision-making, internal choices to prevent a world where, to quote Nick Bostrom, we are lucky that the laws of physics don't allow you to create a nuclear blast by microwaving sand. They are very much looking to prune away spontaneous models that could be established that would be highly destructive. Now, mind you, they are defining what highly destructive means, and highly destructive to what? In the same way the technocracy claims to be meritocratic, but they are choosing how to define what merit is. And that's kind of how they sneak in under it.
So we know that the technocracy just explicitly understands that reality is a thing to be engineered. To me, the entire premise of the Ascension War requires that everyone else understands it to some extent also. If you're fighting a war to control reality, you have to believe that reality is a thing that could be controlled.
But there is the question, to what degree do people believe that is what they're doing? I think that is a question that varies. Some people do very directly view it as controlling reality. Some people abstract it away.
And the default level has varied by edition. In first edition, it seemed pretty explicit that everyone was in agreement on this, that paradigm and focus was, props that people used to trick reality into letting them get away with stuff, and that they often didn't actually truly and deeply believe. Again, the example of the progenitor waving a scalpel and then magically a wound is healed. Cargo cult science, not science. But then by the time you get to second edition, belief is the central thing about mages. They believe their paradigm fully and deeply. And their paradigm, much as I'm sympathetic to the idea that every paradigm should be able to be represented in Mage, I think that some paradigms are going to run into the problem of the fundamental nature of the Mage universe is going to contradict these beliefs. One of those is there is absolute truth in the universe is a hard thing to hold on to when you see the cultist, the Akashic, the Hermetic, and the Iterator all doing stuff that's impossible. In the end, you have to end up coming down with some sort of belief that people can, through many different means, overrule whatever reality says, and then you have to figure out why that's possible, and it gets complicated. And that's why Revised Edition talked about open and closed paradigms and all that stuff. By and large, the way I treat it is that most mages are aware to some extent that they are fighting to change the nature of reality. They believe that their way is the best way for some reason. They might believe that their way is the correct way and that everyone else's ways are wrong and that they are pushing them and making reality bad because of that. But they acknowledge that these other ways exist because they see them with their eyes.
The war for reality, again, I will emphasize that different people view this to different extents. M20, for instance, has the line that perception is reality. So when we say changing reality, we're saying changing perceptions. And that is fundamentally coming from a notion that there is no fundamental truthy substrate that reality is being exuded onto. We also face other problems because if people say belief can change reality, why are there not more paradigms of self-deification? Notably, the only person that went really far with that was Vormos, and I'm going to call him a special case and a bit of a tryhard. One of the limitations on the degree to which paradigm permeates is your ability to generate and consume training material, which is a weird statement to say, but in M20, we get the idea that you really can't learn outside of an established paradigm, seemingly. I don't like that. I kind of like the revised version. You can do it. It takes 5 times longer. So one of the restrictions on paradigm is that there is this natural limiting effect that there don't appear to be arbitrary paradigms because it's really hard to start one. So I imagine most people start pursuing an established one and then start deviating, and that's where they really start hitting dense rock as they try and crawl towards Ascension, as they try and burrow their way into Mount Understanding.
And I would go so far as to say that beyond a certain level, that's almost a necessity to do. If I were to rewrite Masters of the Art, one of the things I would point out is that every mage has a unique path to Archmastery. There is no road you can follow someone else down. You can have mentors teach you through mastery, but beyond that, you are on your own. How Porthos does Forces 6 and how you do Forces 6 are irreconcilable.
Now, to me, one of the things that's interesting is, do mages recognize that there seem to be base laws of their reality that cannot be changed? For instance, certain things are always vulgar? That, I don't know. I think that is very up in the air. Do mages think about things in terms of paradigm? I don't think that is necessarily true. I do think they think about the nature of magic and the consensus, but to me, paradigm is not something they talk about in terms of paradigm.
Yeah, I would say that my default is that every mage has a thing that they believe, and they believe this is how the world works. And the problem is that the consensus that they say the consensus disagrees, and the consensus determines which things are vulgar and which are coincidental. So the world works the way I think it does, but because of those stupid sleepers, I get paradox for it.
Yeah, everything would work out fine if everyone just did what I told them to do.
And this attitude varies, of course, both within and across groups. You're going to get more, I tend to treat there being more resentment towards sleepers causing paradox from Hermetics than from cultists. Mm-hmm. Partly because Hermetics, on average, in my games, do more vulgar things than cultists do. And partly because the Hermetic paradigm, well, you said there aren't more paradigms of self-deification, but I'd argue that is the Order of Hermes paradigm to some extent.
Reasonable, self-perfection, and so on.
You could see aspects of it in the Order of Hermes, in the Akashic Brotherhood, in the Taftani, absolutely. And arguably shades in the Alibatine, in the Society of Ether. I think that self-deification is actually a fairly common thing among mystic paradigms.
I will agree on self-elevation. I have a different thing set. But yeah, I certainly see what you mean. I don't think mages talk about instruments. I don't think they talk necessarily about practices in those terms, in the same way that they may talk about the consensus or the masses or sleepers in those terms.
The only reason I would disagree is, and I don't think they talk about them in those terms per se. Like, I don't think a mage would say, well, I'm going to go use my practice of alchemy. But on the other hand, a mage would say, I am an alchemist. I'm going to go mix up an alchemical potion. I do weird science. It's the greatest. Like, these are definitely things that people do and say that they do, but we're not going to get into issues with the focus mechanics because there are any mechanics, not issues.
Okay. Got it.
Paradigms, as listed in Focus, are a thing that I think that people probably don't talk about in those terms. Like, I have a hard time seeing them saying, oh, well, I believe this is a world of gods and monsters. It's like, that's an odd thing to say.
Yeah.
Whereas, I'm going to go practice my martial arts so I can magic better is a much more natural thing to say, especially for someone who's a little bit tongue-in-cheek because of the phrase magic better.
I think some of the paradigm terms would come up in certain conversations, kind of in the same way that periodically they say the title of the movie in the movie, and they usually do it once, and everyone's like, whoa, your trek across the stars. Thanks, John Delancey. Last question. What does increasing Arite mean in relation to being more enlightened? The M20 answer is, it is force of belief. We do not get a consistent definition. We do not get the revised notice that the scales fall from your eyes and there is unity to it. It is raw metaphysical willpower. You could view it as the ability to believe in such a way that you are more capable of imposing your will on reality, of instantiating your model of reality. It in no way, to me, ties to a metaphysical form of enlightenment, only so much as when you ascend, that is just a greater form of self-delusion that pushes you out of reality in some way. I at first hated this, but in retrospect, I think it is beautiful.
I would go so far as to say that revised is the anomaly, that in second edition it was also just force of belief and not enlightenment. Mm-hmm. Even if words were spilled in order to say it was enlightenment, Masters of the Arts contradicts that.
And to me, one of the problems that I run into here is I feel as if it being force of belief, but also dropping foci, to me, point in opposite directions. I would argue that most mages almost never drop foci because it is so tied with their paradigm that they would never think to not do it. So it is more of a mechanic to reduce difficulty than it is to do improvisational off-the-cuff magic without having any stuff.
My view on that is that we kind of need to rethink fundamentally what Arite 6 Plus and dropping instruments looks like. I really don't like how it's done in M20.
Yeah.
Aside from anything else, thematically, M20 is all about which group you're a member of doesn't matter. Your personal paradigm is what matters. And then suddenly there's mechanics that say, well, if you're a technocrat, it works this way. If you're an Aetheryte or a virtual adept, it works that way. And if you're anyone else, it works this third way. And it's just dissonant with the rest of M20's ethos towards factions. My view is because Arite definitely is not by itself enlightenment. It is force of belief, as you said, in M20, is that I tend to treat there as being at Arite 6. First off, I don't have anyone dropping instruments or anything below Arite 6. Like, being a master is hard. You've worked very hard in this paradigm. You're not setting aside from it. And I don't want you to have the difficulty break, because master level stuff is really, really hard. And that's why, like, to me, a random disciple, like a starting level mage, quintessence is nice, but they don't need it. If a master wants to do stuff, they need quintessence in order to make it manageable. So that's where fighting over nodes and that other high-level stuff in the Ascension War really starts to matter. And then when you hit Arite 6, and I've got a write-up of this that is in a draft. I think it's 2 projects down my roadmap for Storyteller's Vault to put this out. 2 solo projects. I'm working on a lot of collaborations these days. Is that at Arite 6, you end up on a track. And one of those tracks, your Arite does in fact start meaning enlightenment, you start dropping your focus. You become more powerful by understanding what is common among all mages and how malleable reality actually is. That path also leads to some notion of ascension, not very well defined. And then there's the path of, I want forces 6, deal with it. And there, you are never letting go of any of your instruments in any way. You are doubling down on your paradigm, and this is just your sheer force of belief. And the way that I square that with the default is the technocracy doesn't believe in individual ascension, so very few technocrats take the path of individual ascension. Instead, they take greater understanding of science, which is why technocrats almost never drop instruments, because technocrats who get to high Arite are talking about mind 6 and forces 6. They're not talking about becoming one with the universe and no longer needing tools in order to affect it, because after all, if you're one with the universe, then you just change yourself and the universe changes in response.
From what I understand, Arite is an ancient Greek word meaning power stat. So that brings us to the end. Charles, thank you so much for joining. I thought this was a lot of fun. I would love to do another one again. Any projects on the near-term horizon that are coming out, or should we just have you back on when the next one is out in the world?
So I am cleaning up a couple of projects for release. I think last time I was here, I mentioned a small project involving tradition corporations for use with Rich Bastard's Guide. I have since written a follow-up to Pukaji's Book of Fragments that uses minor spheres as a means to handle crossover mages, like ghoul mages, kinfolk mages, and so on, by giving them access to some specialized minor spheres that are thematically appropriate for the type of supernatural being that they are associated with. This way, you don't have to worry about being a mage ST adjudicating the use of disciplines. You just get mages who have the sphere of blood. Those I am working on. I'm working on editing, art direction, and layout for them.
Okay.
Hopefully, they'll be landing on Storyteller's Vault soon.
And we look forward to talking about your other projects as they come to fruition. Charles, thank you so much for joining.
Yep, of course.
This has been Mage the Podcast, where the preface to seemingly every question is, well, it varies by edition. Our show is made possible by our executive producers, who include Buck Farmer, Oracle of Thorny Setting Questions, The Crew of Erebus, Oracle of Thorny Metaplot Questions, Christopher Phillips, Oracle of Thorny System Questions, Mikhail, Oracle of Thorny Effect Adjudication Questions, and Jay Widener, Oracle of Thorns, the city recently taken over by the Mask of Winters after the disappearance of the Scarlet Empress in Exalted. Additionally, I'd like to thank Alex, Alexia, Anders S., Andrew Edelstein, Anon, Berto, Blaze Hebert, Boo, Boogers to the Sixth, Brett of the Blue, Bryce Perry, Chris B., Daniel Cuppen, Daniel Scribner, Dan Svensson, David Roy, Dennis Osborne, Derek Semsek, Gargle Noir, George Lara, Guy Conan Stewart, Ia Bull, Jason Kennedy, Jason Vines, Jason W. Biggs, Jeff Bryn, Jenna F., John Magnuson, Josh H., Joshua Heath, Kathleen Halperin, Leslie Weatherstone, Matthew Prohl, Michael Creedle, Michael Parker, Morgan Aran, Nathan Weaver, Nibero, Neil Patterson, Nikita Klaimanov, Oliver Schindler, Patrick McNamara, Patrick Mulder, Pukuji, Rachel Grace, Ralph Scheinheimer, Ricardo, Richard Bat Brewster, Robart the Robot, Rob H., Ryan Kendi, Samuel Tobin, Stephen Carton, Thrice Great, William Conley, William Martin, and Zach Rules. Our EP shout-out this episode is to an easy one, Pukaji, who is one of the hosts of the Delightful Changeling the podcast, who is doing a mix of book discussions and topic discussions with fellow friend of the show, Josh H., the other Josh H. If you like the format of Mage the Podcast, you'll probably like that one too. Puka's also done a number of Storyteller Vault supplements, including one on minor spheres called The Book of Fragments, as well as a recent supplement on bog mummies, because the answer to the question of what might the world of darkness need more of is almost always mummies. Thanks, Puka. If you super liked this episode or super didn't, drop us a line at magethepodcast@gmail.com or at magethepodcast on Twitter. We have a Hop and Discord community at discord.me/magethepodcast. If you like us, please give us a review on the platform of your choosing or tell a friend about us. Also go to magethepodcast.com for show notes and all of our previous shows. Now go change reality. Bye.